Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we'll be talking about the rise of China and how that nation has become an economic superpower in just over the past 3 decades. My guest today is Dr. Jack Hao. Dr. Hao is a professor of economics and he is an expert in China's economic development. Jack, thanks for joining us here on Talking Points.
My pleasure.
Jack, I'm going to start by quoting from a report for the Congressional Research Service written by Wayne Morrison. The report encapsulates China's development story over the past 35 years. The report states, "The rapid rise of China as a major economic power within a time span of about 3 decades is often described by analysts as one of the greatest economic success stories in modern times. From 1979, when the reforms began, to today, China's real gross domestic product, or GDP, grew at an average annual rate of nearly 10%. China's real gross domestic product is, of course, the driver of what has allowed this development. To date, more than 500 million people have been raised out of extreme poverty in China. China has emerged as a major global economic power. It's the world's largest manufacturer, the largest merchandise exporter, and a holder of foreign exchange reserves. It's currently the second largest economy after the United States, but most experts believe that's going to change in about 5 years. How did this story begin in 1979? But let's talk first about what was happening in China prior to that. We know that China had what is referred to as a state-controlled command economy based on the Soviet model. What does that all mean?
Well, in a planned Soviet model, the individual's job assignment, the factories, resource allocation, their output, where they are allocated are all designated in the 5-year plan. We can break it down into ideological and economics. Ideological, in a market system like us, we talk about level playing field, equal footing starting point, and where you end up depends on your talent, how hard you work. But in a planned economy, Soviet style, they are concerned about we all wind up where we are together. In other words, an individual does not have to worry about his employment. An individual does not have to worry about his old age standard of living. The state takes care of that. So it's an equality at the end of the race versus an equality at the beginning of the race that is more of the US level playing field. But that lacks economic incentive, because if we are all guaranteed our jobs, if factories are guaranteed their business, if all workers after they retire are guaranteed a specific standard of living, where is the incentive? And that is part of the problem. But it is also marred by natural disasters and man-made disasters. Man-made disasters, I allude to the Great Leap Forward, the 3 Red Flags, and the Cultural Revolution. These linked to 2 major food crises in China in '67 and in the early 1970s. So by that time, China had difficulty feeding its people.
And also China was more of an isolationist type of country at that time.
Yes, at that time, China did not have any economic relationship with the West. It did have relationship with Mexico for a while, with Argentina, with Chile, when they had more pro-communist socialist dictators. But they did not trade with what we conventionally called a market economy of the Western society.
But there was recognition in China after the death of Mao Zedong in 1976 that things had to change. And the new leader, Deng Xiaoping, was pushing economic reforms which were adopted in December of 1978 by the Central Party Committee and then implemented it starting in 1979. Those reforms included creating 4 economic zones along the eastern coast of China. And really, the purpose of those zones was to experiment with free market principles. Talk about that, if you would, for a moment.
A lot of people in the West do not realize Deng Xiaoping and the Communist Party, what they implemented in 78, 79, was actually attempted in the early 60s, after the 3 bad years of natural disaster. They tried with economic reform, with incentives to the farmers, but Mao Zedong, in an attempt to regain power, mobilized the Little Red Guards, started the Cultural Revolution, and Deng Xiaoping was imprisoned. So when Deng Xiaoping was released after Mao Zedong's death, it is a recontinuation of what they were doing in the 60s. But I do want to clarify, it does not mean China started its reform in the 60s. What I would deem in the 60s is a strategic maneuver. But what they did in 78, 79 is an entire change of battle plan.
And when they developed these economic zones, the zones were freed up from a lot of the state control, the central party control. They were given the opportunity to engage in more trade with foreign countries, to encourage more investment coming into China, and to also allow for the importation of the high technology that would help advance China's infrastructure.
That is correct. Not completely successful. The second part was quite successful. China heavily subsidized a lot of its heavy industry, forklifts, etc. They were heavily subsidized so they could compete in the world market. But whatever hard currency they were able to obtain were mandatory sold back to the government. And that is how the government was able to obtain hard currency to get the needed resources and technology to develop China. In terms of the attracting foreign investment, to be honest, in the entire 1980s, success was quite limited. If you want to point your finger at countries that were more successful in that period, I would have to say it was Hong Kong and Taiwan, because they shared the culture, while the West lacked the culture and language, and, to be frank, the trust to go to China. So in the 80s, the success was limited. And remember, at that time, all foreign investors, what you produced can only be exported.
Well, you brought up a good point, and that is, you mentioned two of the four tigers of Asia that were rising at that time. We had Taiwan, we had Hong Kong, and we had South Korea and Singapore. And that's where all the attention was focused by the media and others, was on those four tigers and how powerful they were. But China was the sleeping giant. How did they emerge from that sleeping giant stage then eventually to start really coming on strong?
China really came on strong, a couple of things. Domestically, they started relaxing internal travel. In the old days, if you want to leave where your job is assigned to go somewhere else, you have to have travel papers. They relaxed that, and also it was under food rationing. So if you left from, say, an inner province to Shanghai, that means you don't get food because you don't have the food ration coupons. They gradually loosened that. That allowed workers to move from inland towards the coastal cities, where they could be employed by the foreign companies. As I said earlier, foreign companies were not totally interested in China because they could only export. They could not access the domestic market of China. And to make things worse, since China needed the hard currency, the foreign countries, foreign investors were not able to take their US dollars out. But in the early mid-1990s, China started to allow foreign investors, foreign companies to access Chinese domestic market. And that changed the game.
So now the companies that were investing had incentive to invest more.
Exactly, lured by the great potential of the domestic market, combined with what I mentioned of the loosening of the travel, loosening of the food ration coupons, we started seeing millions upon millions of peasants leaving the hinterland to come to the coast. And remember, as I said, in the 70s, China's big problem was not being able to feed its people. So the first 6 years of China's reform was exclusively in the rural area about farming.
Agricultural reform.
Exactly. That gave incentive for the farmers, became more, because, for example, say, Dave, you are a farmer, you sign a contract with the central government. The central government leases you this land. and you sign a contract that you are going to sell to the Chinese central government or provincial government 10,000 kilos of rice at a pre-negotiated low price. But if you were able to produce 15,000 kilos, that additional 5,000 is at your disposal and you can sell it at whatever price you can get. That is the economic incentive, and allowed the food production in China to skyrocket, more efficient, and freed up a tremendous amount of peasants in the rural area.
And they were looking for jobs.
Exactly.
And they were able to then travel to the coast and find those opportunities because simultaneously factory development was going very strongly at that time.
Yes.
And so you had the available population. You had a government that was very willing to invest in manufacturing and building plants. And you had, again, in those economic zones, some folks who were able to start some what we would refer to as private enterprise operations. And how did that all culminate in the early 2000s?
Well, in the early 2000s, I would always like to pinpoint 2001. 2001 was when China joined the WTO. At that time, China's joining the WTO was, at that time, very risky. There were a lot of concern among domestic Chinese economists. They were worried about the lack of productivity. A lot of Chinese industries might be wiped out. And a serious concern was about its agricultural sector. Turns out that was a little bit unwarranted. We did see a dramatic change in China's landscape in terms of agriculture. The farmers were forced to be more specialized and hence improve their efficiency, which is a good thing. And then, because they are able to enjoy a lower import tariff from the US point of view, that allowed China to be more profitable, and the government systematically encouraged both government-owned enterprise, I like to call them, a lot of them are semi-private enterprise, and foreign enterprise. In my opinion, over-expanded the labor-intensive, export-oriented industry. But I'll get to that in more detail later on.
Jack, we've come to the end of this first segment, but we're really getting into the meat of the subject, and we'll continue this discussion in just a moment. Stay with us. We're going to continue this fascinating discussion with Dr. Jack Howe in just a moment.
Hi, I'm Andrea Caban, and I'm the head of Voice and Speech in the Theater Arts Department. And this summer, I'm going to be teaching an online course called How the World Talks. It's Theater 212, where we will be exploring all the sounds in human language, from beatboxing sounds like to clicks like, in order to become more confident and articulate speakers. It's going to work great in the online format. We are going to make videos and create sound samples. I think it's going to be a really fun and rewarding summer course.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. My guest today is Dr. Jack Howe. He's a professor of economics and an expert on China's economic development. Jack, before the break, we were talking about the so-called economic miracle of China, and over the past 30 to 35 years, how they did what they did and how they became this economic superpower that we see today. Just a little more on that, and then we'll talk about some of the consequences of such rapid growth. First of all, there's a statistic out now that indicates that around 1980 or so, when this began, trade between the United States and China was right around $5 billion annually. Today, we see it's about $558 billion or so, which is about 110 times the amount of economic activity in terms of trade. So that's a huge boom. So compare, 1978 to today one more time to sort of summarize this economic growth.
Yeah, the trade statistics is astonishing, but you see similar parallel growth in various aspects. If you look at the World Bank publication 2012, The US, in terms of per capita GDP, is ranked 6th in the world. China is 93 out of 188, almost right smack in the middle. But that's not very informative. If you look at inflation adjusted, 2,000 constant dollars, the per capita GDP in China in 1980 was just over 200 US dollars per person. But now it's approaching 3,500. Again, we're talking about 12, 15, 17 times growth. What I prefer more is to look at population adjusted. In 1978, only 0.5% of the world population had a per capita income lower than China. Today, 50% of the world population has a per capita GDP lower than China. And I think that is very telling. And on population, at the beginning of the reform, China's population was 26% of the world. Now it's only 19.6%. And that is, quote unquote, the success of the one-child policy, which has its consequences.
You've mentioned a lot of things that we need to explore here. First of all, let's talk about the consequences of such rapid economic growth and what the impact was on the country from an environmental standpoint. When you build that many factories that quickly, what happens?
Well, when you build it that quickly and the government does not have a mature, complete social political institution to govern this, and when the central leadership is single-mindedly only focused on GDP, perhaps per capita GDP, there are consequences because all the other social wellness, air pollution, income equality, and such are of, I wouldn't say no importance, but certainly way down in the list. China's pollution is approaching catastrophic. We have a lot of jokes, for example, just to share with the audience. People in Beijing, one of the most polluted cities, claim that they are the world's biggest vacuum cleaner because they suck in the smog and actually exhale clearer air.
So what goes out is cleaner than what comes in.
Yes.
You know, there's also another term that they're using in China, tongue-in-cheek, and that term is Airpocalypse, because the quality of air was so poor this winter that we saw clouds of smog over half of the country.
Yes, I've actually heard reports that smog is appearing in Xinjiang and even in Tibet. So that tells you it's not localized, it's not isolated. That's what I mean by it's approaching a catastrophic, almost point of no return. Of course, I'm not an environmental economist, so I'm not a specialist on this, but what I understand, a major cause of the problem is the Chinese government in their attempt to lower the cost when they were refining gasoline, they did not refine it to a world standard, shall we say. In other words, a lot of the sulfur was not refined out. And as you mentioned in our discussion earlier, the coal burning in the winter for heat is also another major culprit. But when you have a government that is single-minded in trying to achieve economic growth and not pay attention to these type of social well-being deficiencies, I guess it is not surprising.
There was a study put out by the Asian Development Bank about air pollution in China, and they indicated that according to World Health Organization standards, less than 1% of China's largest 500 cities are in compliance with that standard. And to make matters worse, 7 out of 10 of the top polluted cities in the world are located in China. And so that must be having an impact on the leaders in China today as they contemplate this.
Yes, and the Chinese leadership, actually, to their credit, I do not know the details, but to their credit, they have announced, I think relatively recently, their determination. If it is a sincere determination, I actually do believe the Chinese government can do this. The Chinese government, because it is still a centrally controlled government, if they have the will they can actually almost move mountains. We talked about Beijing as heavily polluted. Part of the condition for them getting the 2008 Beijing Olympics was they had to clean the air. And they did it. They did it. So if the government has the will, they can do that. The question is they have to do a tight balancing act between the cost of cleaning the air, which means lower economic growth.
So they'll have to take that into account in the
Yes.
future. In China, they always operate on 5-year economic plans. They're in the 12th five-year plan, which is from 2010 to 2015. And according to the congressional research report that I quoted from earlier, there are 3 main objectives in the current 5-year plan. And the first one was economic reform, which we started to talk about. The second one was promoting greater social equality, which I find interesting, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then the third one is concentrating on environmental protection. So the first one is pretty obvious. They want to continue to refine their economy so that it continues to be productive, and there are some concerns about where China sits in the future in terms of competition for manufacturing. But the second one is the one I find the most interesting, amusing, and perhaps a little ironic, because we're talking about a communist country, or today I guess they like to refer to themselves as a socialist market economy.
With Chinese characteristics.
There you go. And but in either case, promoting greater social equality, why has that become such an issue?
In the rapid growth of China, we see what I politely call rent-seeking, or if you want to be more bluntly, it would be corruption, where government officials who have the authority either to authorize or, if they control vital resources, cooperate, maybe collude, with merchants, entrepreneurs, to bring the resources or allow the entrepreneurs to engage in activity that was before perhaps not allowed. This, of course, creates multi-millionaires, billionaires abound. This also results in those that have the control, have the connection, versus those that don't have. You result in extreme income inequality. Research after 3 years of hard work, Southwest University of Finance and Economics published a series of research, and they conservatively estimate that China's Gini coefficient is 0.6. In comparison, the US, which we often criticize as being unequal in distribution, is only about 0.45. The larger, the worse it gets. So that tells you how bad China is.
And in terms of what this means as far as corruption is concerned, because that's what you're talking about, China recognizes that this is a serious problem both internally with the populace and also in terms of the media, that and certainly the outside media, that whenever they can, they will report on this. But apparently in recent years, the Chinese government has acknowledged that something like 106,000 officials have been brought up and convicted on corruption charges. Now the question I have is this just a PR effort and the tip of the iceberg, or does this represent a true effort to crack down on corruption?
Well, Dave, I've been asking that question for the past 14 months. Every time I go to China, whoever I meet at whatever occasion, I do ask this question. I said, the General Secretary Xi, his attempt to root out corruption, is it for show or is he playing for real? At the beginning, I think a lot of people were not sure whether he had the determination, and I think the verdict now is half-half, perhaps a little heavy on that he is serious. And in my opinion, it's a do or die time if in the next 10 years, well, 9 years, under General Secretary Xi, if he cannot take care of this and regain the confidence and trust of the people, China may have some form of political unrest. And this inequality, as you mentioned, it is a little bit sarcastic. It's supposed to be a communist, equal, proletarian state, yet the income distribution makes the U.S. actually look good.
And as there's so many things that we could talk about in terms of the problems inherent with a state-run economy, such as the banking system, where people are concerned that the World Bank actually stated that perhaps 25% of state-owned enterprises are not showing a profit. And so in other words, they're being given loans but not paying them back, or they're not making good on certain promises that they're making, but because the government doesn't want to acknowledge this, they're covering it up. Is that a problem?
That is a problem, of course, and the Chinese government, I actually do have fair amount of confidence that they will be able to deal with this to some success. In about 10 years ago, China had a similar problem with the rural banks, where they had a lot of bad loans, and the current governor of the People's Bank, Zhou Xiaochuan, I actually attended one of his talks, and he laid out the strategy of how to gradually deal with all these bad debt, and under his leadership, he was able to deal with that. The Chinese government is very concerned about the banking industry, and if you look at the guidelines they published around June last year, they had 7 main points in the every year they announce a short list of the focus of reform, and of that 7 points announced in June, half of them were related to saving, investment, and the banking industry.
And Jack, we're going to have to end on that note. We've run out of time. There's so many things that we could talk about. Perhaps we'll have to pick up this conversation again. But thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points. Join us again for another edition soon. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.